It starts here, not with bombs, not with missiles, but with a name. Persia, not Iran. Persia, a word echoing through centuries like the footsteps of Alexander's horses across ancient Mesopotamian sands. The streets of Tehran today may buzz with mopeds and modern stress, but beneath the concrete pulses the weight of an empire that never truly collapsed. Imagine a land older than most of recorded history, alive not just in monuments, but in the memory of every geopolitical strategist on Earth. Iran isn't merely a country. It is the geopolitical center of gravity, in a game where the players are nuclear powers, oil monarchies, and religious dogma. War is never black and white. Subscribe and turn on notifications to explore the hidden truths behind history's greatest conflicts. And from the start, the contradiction was there. Iran, or Persia, is not Arab. Not by blood, not by language, not by religion. Persians speak Farsi, not Arabic. They are Shiite Muslims, not Sunni. This matters deeply, because in the Islamic world, those distinctions are not just theological. They are battle lines. Sunnis dominate the Islamic world, but Shiites dominate Iran. And that makes Iran the heretic empire of Islam, the empire that refuses to kneel. Here's the twist. Being the outcast gave Iran power. Like a rogue bishop in a game of geopolitical chess, it moves unpredictably. And in a region where most countries were invented by European colonialists a century ago, Iran can claim 2,800 years of continuous identity. Persia fought Alexander the Great, traded with Rome, resisted the Mongols, and outlasted the Ottomans. That kind of historical memory is dangerous. It doesn't think in election cycles. It thinks in dynasties. So why do many still mistakenly group Iranians with Arabs? It's not ignorance, it's simplification. Arab equals Muslim, Muslim equals Middle East, and that's good enough for headlines, but it's not good enough for war. How do you think this confusion has shaped global perceptions of the Middle East? The Persians were not farmers like the Chinese, nor seafaring traders like the Greeks. They were horsemen, nomads, tribes shaped by a harsh geography, molded into warriors by survival. Their lands, steppes, deserts, highlands, did not yield crops easily. They bred empires instead. To rule such a space required not laws, but strength, not votes, but swords. One name stands above the rest: Cyrus the Great, founder of the Achaemenid Empire. Revered not just for conquest, but for wisdom. Even the Bible speaks of him with respect. He freed the Jews from Babylonian captivity. Think about that. Iran's cultural identity is woven with benevolent imperialism. Not just power, but righteous power. And that righteousness still echoes today. Iran's clerics don't see themselves as politicians. They see themselves as heirs of Cyrus and guardians of divine order. But that self-image leads to a terrifying conclusion. If they are righteous, then their enemies must be evil. Not wrong, not misguided, evil. And evil must be destroyed. Here's where it turns personal. Iran's goal isn't to win a conventional war. Iran's goal is theological. Its leaders believe they are fighting a cosmic battle. The enemy isn't Israel for its land, nor America for its oil, but for what they represent. A world where God is not the ruler. How do you negotiate with a nation whose goal isn't gain but divine revenge? Let's jump forward to a name you know: Alexander the Great. His conquest of Persia wasn't just military, it was cultural. He didn't just beat Persia, he became part of it. He married a Persian woman, wore Persian clothes, adopted Persian customs. Persia always had this gravitational pull, absorbing its enemies. Even conquerors became converts. This adaptability would define Persia's survival. After Alexander came the Seleucids, then came the Parthians, then the Sasanians, then the Arab conquest in the 7th century, which converted the region to Islam. But again, Persia didn't just accept. It transformed. It twisted Arab Islam into something uniquely Persian: Shi'ism. Not submission, but reinterpretation. Which brings us to an eternal conflict: Sunni versus Shiite. It started as a political succession crisis after Prophet Muhammad's death. Should leadership stay in the family, Shiite, or be elected among the faithful, Sunni? That's the root. But centuries turned that political feud into a cosmic schism, and Iran, being the Shiite stronghold, has weaponized this divide. Do you think that split will ever be healed? Or is it now too deeply embedded in identity? Now look westward. The British Empire arrives. Britain wanted India, but Persia was in the way. So they did what empires always do: divide and conquer. In the 19th century, Persia was carved into zones of influence between Russia and Britain. Persia didn't agree. Persia didn't matter. This colonial humiliation birthed a fury that lives on in every Iranian protest. "We were once an empire," they whisper. "Now you draw lines on maps and call us rogue." And so, Iran made a decision: never again. Enter Reza Shah Pahlavi. In 1921, he staged a coup. By 1925, he declared himself Shah, Emperor of Iran. His mission? Modernize, westernize, railroads, schools, universities, women's rights. He admired Ataturk in Turkey. He wanted a secular Iran, strong and respected. But modernization came with suppression. The clergy resisted. They were imprisoned, exiled, executed. One of them, exiled to Paris, was named Ruhollah Khomeini. What happens when modernity is imposed by force? Can a nation ever be dragged into progress? Then came World War II. Reza Shah leaned toward Nazi Germany, not out of ideology but as a counter to British and Soviet bullying. Britain and the USSR responded by invading. They deposed him, installed his son, and occupied Iran. Again, Iran was a pawn in someone else's war. This constant manipulation, this colonial betrayal, is why Iran sees enemies in every Western handshake. And when oil was discovered in massive quantities, the exploitation deepened. British companies took the lion's share. Iran pumped the oil. Britain took the profit. Do you think any nation would forget that kind of theft? And here's the paradox. Iran is not poor, its land bleeds wealth, but it is constantly besieged. Surrounded by allies of its enemies. Its only friends are militias, proxies, and ghosts of dead empires. So it chooses resistance. Resistance as a national identity. Resistance as religion. Resistance as empire reborn. If Iran is the most dangerous actor in the Middle East, maybe it's because it has the longest memory. Maybe it's not fighting for today, but for every yesterday. What's more dangerous, a country with no future, or one haunted by a glorious past? At the heart of every oil field lies a secret, not just energy, but leverage. And in the 20th century, no country realized this truth more dramatically than Iran. The wells that bubbled beneath Persian soil weren't just fueling machines, they were fueling revolutions. And they weren't just controlled by Iranians. No, the British called the shots. The profits, the power, the politics, it all flowed through London. Until one man changed that. Mohammad Mossadegh. In 1951, this mild-mannered, European-educated prime minister decided to nationalize Iran's oil industry. Simple, right? Take back control of your country's resources. But to the British, this was war. To America, it was dangerous precedent. What if other nations started nationalizing too? So they toppled him. Not with tanks, but with dollars, spies, and propaganda. Operation Ajax, a CIA-backed coup in 1953. Mossadegh was out, the Shah was back. And Iran learned a lesson it would never forget. Challenge the West, and you will be crushed. And yet Mossadegh didn't vanish from Iranian memory. His portrait hangs in living rooms. His name is whispered in schools, He became something more than a leader. He became the ghost of dignity lost. Is it any wonder that future revolutions would be driven by reclaiming that dignity? Here's the curveball. The Shah who returned wasn't just a puppet. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi wanted more than to rule. He wanted to dazzle. In the 1960s and 70s, he launched the White Revolution, a top-down modernization campaign. Land reform, voting rights for women, industrial growth. Iran began to shine. Western-educated elites flourished. Tehran looked like Paris. The elite held champagne soirees under chandeliers, while women walked freely without veils. But here's the rub. Beneath that polished surface, the countryside boiled. Clerics saw their mosques empty. Tribal leaders saw their lands stripped. Poor villagers, watching their traditions dissolve, heard a different voice rising from exile. His name? Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. From his exile in Paris, Khomeini issued cassette tapes filled with fiery sermons. They were smuggled into Iran and played in secret gatherings. His message was simple and terrifying. The Shah is corrupt. The West is evil. Islam must rise again. And unlike the Shah's polished English, Khomeini spoke in the voice of the people, the voice of the forgotten. This is where history pivots. Because the revolution of 1979 wasn't about Islam at first, it was about anger. Workers, students, secularists, Islamists, all united to topple a dictator. The Shah fled. Khomeini returned. And the crowd greeted him like a messiah. But revolutions are rarely about what they promise. The people wanted a democracy. Khomeini gave them a theocracy. He held a referendum. Do you want to replace the monarchy with an Islamic republic? Over 98% said yes, but they didn't know what they were voting for. The constitution that followed was unlike anything Iran had ever known. Yes, it had a president. Yes, it had a parliament. But above them all stood a new figure, the supreme leader, a man not elected by the people, but chosen by clerics. His power? Absolute. Law, war, media, education, all bent to his will. In Iran, the real revolution wasn't in the streets. It was in the footnotes of that constitution. And who was that first supreme leader? Ayatollah Khomeini. From that moment, Iran's direction changed forever. The clocks in government buildings began showing not one time, but two, the Gregorian year and the Islamic one. Women were forced to wear the hijab. Alcohol was banned. Music was censored. And the whispers grew into screams. And then, just months into the new regime, came an earthquake, the hostage crisis. On November 4, 1979, hundreds of Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. They took 52 Americans hostage. Why? Because America had given the Shah refuge. But this wasn't just about justice. It was about spectacle. Khomeini saw the hostage crisis as a divine gift. It united the fractured revolution. It painted America as the villain. And it made Iran the center of global attention. The hostages were held for 44 days. Negotiations failed. A U.S. rescue mission failed, tragically. And President Jimmy Carter's popularity collapsed. Here's the twist. Ronald Reagan won the election in 1980. And on the very day he took office, the hostages were released. Conspiracy? A backroom deal? History still debates it. There are whispers of secret meetings, of delayed releases, of political theater at its cruelest. Do you believe in coincidence or in calculation? That same year, Iraq invaded Iran. Saddam Hussein, backed quietly by the West, launched an 8-year war of horror. Chemical weapons, child soldiers, trench warfare. Over 1 million lives lost. And yet Iran didn't break. Instead, it hardened. It learned how to survive under siege, how to use martyrdom as strategy, how to bleed and still stand. But here's the revelation. While the U.S. supported Iraq publicly, it secretly sold arms to Iran, through Israel, through back channels. This was the Iran-Contra affair, and it's one of the darkest examples of geopolitical duplicity in U.S. history. Sell weapons to both sides. Fund rebels in Central America with the profits. Deny everything. Blame a scapegoat, and carry on. What does it say about war when profit trumps principle? By the end of the 1980s, Khomeini was dead. But the system he built, supreme leader, revolutionary guards, Islamic courts, was alive and well. His successor, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was more cautious, more strategic, but no less ideological. And here's where Iran's next evolution begins. Not in Tehran, but in Beirut. Enter Hezbollah. Born in the chaos of Lebanon's civil war, funded and trained by Iran, Hezbollah wasn't just a militia. It was Iran's first external arm. Then came Hamas in Palestine, the Houthis in Yemen, Shia militias in Iraq and Syria. Iran's strategy became clear. If you can't fight the West directly, then fight through proxies. Plant fires around your enemies and control the smoke. It's clever, it's deadly, and it's working. The debate still rages. Is Iran defending itself or exporting revolution? In the 2000s, Iran's nuclear ambitions came under scrutiny. Enrichment facilities hidden underground, scientists assassinated, sanctions imposed, a deal was signed, then it was broken. Now the centrifuges spin again. But all of this misses the deeper truth. Iran doesn't want war. It wants deterrence. It wants to be untouchable. But in seeking that power, it fuels the very fears that isolate it. So here we are, a theocracy with revolutionary dreams, a nation with oil, history, and ideology. A regime that silences dissent, empowers proxies, and defies the West. And the people? The Iranian people? They remain caught in between. Silenced, surveilled, sacrificed. When history judges Iran, will it see a villain, a victim, or both? If the world were a chessboard, Iran wouldn't be a king or a queen. It would be the hidden hand that tips the board when no one's looking. In the 21st century, Iran doesn't just wield power, it wields narrative. And its story, unlike most, is told not in state speeches or military parades, but in the voices of militias, in the chants of protests, and in the silence of oil pipelines suddenly disrupted. The year is 2012. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, now firmly established as Iran's supreme leader, makes a seismic declaration. Iran will support any group, any nation, whose goal is the destruction of Israel. A vow not of diplomacy but of holy war. And that's when Iran's shadow campaign expands rapidly. Hezbollah grows more brazen in Lebanon. Hamas intensifies its resistance in Gaza. The Houthis, once obscure rebels in Yemen, rise in power. All connected, all funded, all trained by Iran. What emerges is a web of influence, a network of rage and ideology, stretching from the Mediterranean to the Arabian Sea. Here's a famous figure to anchor the narrative: Qasem Soleimani, commander of the Quds Force, the elite unit of Iran's Revolutionary Guards responsible for operations outside Iran. He wasn't just a general, he was a ghost, moving silently across Syria, Iraq, Lebanon. Architects of America's wars admitted, if he were on our side, we'd call him a hero. But he wasn't. He was Iran's dagger abroad, and in January 2020, the U.S. killed him in a drone strike. Iran's response? Not just missiles, not just rhetoric, but renewed commitment. His funeral drew millions. His face plastered on murals. He became a martyr overnight. Iran's enemies had struck, and in doing so, gave his legend eternal life. Do assassinations make nations safer, or make their enemies immortal? Meanwhile, Iran's domestic landscape remains suffocating. The morality police roam the streets. Women are beaten for unveiling. Protesters disappear. Yet every few years the streets rise. Women burn hijabs. Students chant slogans not against Israel, but against their own rulers. Death to the dictator rings louder than death to America. And here's the tragedy. Many outside Iran still conflate its people with its regime. But they are not the same. The Iranian regime rules with iron theology. The Iranian people, especially its youth, crave freedom. How long can such a contradiction endure? Now zoom out. Israel surrounded. Gaza to the southwest. Lebanon to the north. Syria and Iran to the east. And through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the Houthis threaten naval passage in the Red Sea. Iran doesn't need to launch an invasion. It can strangle the region with proxies. This isn't just about missiles. It's about shipping lanes, about oil, about choke points like the Strait of Hormuz, through which 1/5 of the world's oil supply flows. Iran can block it. It's threatened to. That's real power, not just to fight, but to freeze the arteries of the global economy. There are still people who argue whether Iran is a revolutionary state or a defensive one. But that debate misses the point. Iran is a state that needs conflict to justify its structure. In peace, theocracy weakens. In war, it thrives. Let's revisit the most recent flashpoint, October 7, 2023. Hamas launches a brutal surprise attack on Israel. Missiles, infiltrations, civilian deaths. The world reels. Israel responds with fury. Gaza is bombed relentlessly. Civilians, Palestinians, pay the highest price. But this isn't spontaneous. It's timed, coordinated, and above all, strategic. Behind the scenes, the real puppeteer is Iran. Why now? Because Israel and Saudi Arabia were nearing normalization. Peace between the two great rivals of the region would isolate Iran. So Iran disrupts it. Chaos again as policy. And just days later, the Houthis attack commercial ships in the Red Sea. Coincidence? Hardly. It's a message. Iran doesn't need to be everywhere. It just needs to remind you it can be. That's where this gets existential. Iran's strategy is not conquest. It's sabotage. It's not about invasion. It's about making everyone else's plans fail. Consider this quirky story. In 2018, Israeli intelligence agents smuggled out 1/2 ton of Iranian nuclear documents from a secret warehouse in Tehran. A James Bond operation, humiliating for Iran. But did it stop Iran's nuclear program? No. It simply pushed it deeper underground. Literally. The nuclear issue is a slow-burn crisis. Everyone suspects Iran is weeks away from building a bomb. But no one dares force the question. Because if Iran isn't close, attacking them might make them start. And if Iran is close, the retaliation would be cataclysmic. What's worse? Believing Iran is bluffing, or discovering it's not. And so the region remains trapped. Israel, caught between defense and destruction. Arab states, caught between normalization and betrayal. The US, still entangled. Russia and China, circling opportunistically. And Iran? Iran waits. Iran whispers. Iran bleeds, but it doesn't die. Because Iran, for all its darkness, plays the long game. It isn't rushing to win. It's ensuring others don't. In the end, the question isn't, what will Iran do? It's, what won't it prevent? And maybe that's the most dangerous power of all. In the fading twilight of geopolitical memory, Iran lingers like a shadow cast by ancient empires. Its past is not buried. It breathes through the defiant chants in Tehran's streets and echoes in every missile launched from distant proxies. The story of Iran is not linear. It coils like smoke, rising from centuries of conquest, betrayal, reform, and revolution. To understand Iran is not to excuse it, but to acknowledge its complexity, its wounds, and its relentless pursuit of sovereignty in a world determined to strip it away. What we've seen is not merely a nation with a controversial government, it's an entire civilization wrestling with identity. Iran is both the torchbearer of the Persian legacy and the architect of a radical Islamic state. It builds nuclear labs with one hand and shelters poets with the other. It funds guerrillas and educates women. It suppresses freedom and speaks of justice. Contradiction is its constant. But beneath the Ayatollah's cloak, beneath the Revolutionary Guard's rifles, lives of people who have not surrendered. Young Iranians with cell phones and satellite dreams, women who write resistance into lipstick, artists who smuggle color through censors. The fire that once forged empires now burns quietly, defiantly. As the world watches Gaza, watches Hormuz, watches the Red Sea, it must remember, the greatest danger isn't a country with weapons. It's a country with nothing left to lose, and a memory longer than its enemies' patience. In a world of short-term politics, Iran thinks in centuries. And sometimes, the past doesn't just inform the future, it pulls it backward. So, ask yourself one last time, is Iran the problem, or is it the mirror in which all other powers refuse to see themselves?